In a narrow stone building tucked behind the great cathedral of St. Hildegard stood a library that few ever visited. It was not grand, not like the royal libraries of Paris or Florence. Its windows were small, its air cool and heavy with the smell of old parchment. Dust lingered in soft layers over the shelves, as if even time itself had chosen to rest there. And within this quiet maze of books lived Margery of Kent, the librarian who catalogued silence. She had not always been a librarian. In her youth, she had been a scribe, copying legal records for the local court. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unhurried. It was this patience, this ability to sit for hours without stirring, that caught the attention of the abbot, who needed someone to tend to the cathedral's modest collection of manuscripts. It was a small library then, a few shelves of theology, several volumes of philosophy, and a scattering of old chronicles. But Margery accepted the post, moved her few belongings into a chamber beside the library, and began what would become the quiet work of her lifetime. She rose each morning before the bells and walked the cloister garden. The dew clung to the grass, and the air smelled faintly of ink and lilies. When the sun rose high enough to reach the library windows, she unlocked the door and began her routine. The first task was always dusting. She did not rush it. With a soft cloth made from old linen, she moved slowly down each shelf, lifting each book gently, brushing away the thin film that gathered overnight. Too many, it would have seemed tedious, but to Margery, it was a form of reverence. Dust, she often thought, was the handwriting of time. After dusting came inspection. She examined the bindings for cracks, the parchment for signs of wormholes, the ink for fading. Every mark mattered. A small tear could spread like disease. A little dampness could ruin a century's work. So, she mended with paste and care. The faint rustle of parchment, the only sound that accompanied her through the hours. The visitors came rarely. A priest seeking a sermon source. A student hoping to glimpse Aristotle. Sometimes a traveler who claimed to know Latin but only wanted shelter from the rain. Margery helped each with polite efficiency, but her true devotion was not to the living. It was to the manuscripts themselves. Each book seemed to her like a sleeping creature. When she opened one, she did so gently, as if waking an old friend. She would run her fingers lightly over the margins, feeling where the ink thickened, where the quill had pressed harder. She wondered about the men who had written these words, monks in candlelight, scholars squinting through dim afternoons, and about whether they ever imagined someone centuries later would still be reading their thoughts in near silence. Her favorite manuscript was an anonymous treatise on silence, written, according to its preface, for the souls who dwell more in thought than in speech. It was a small book, bound in worn calfskin, its corners soft from handling. She kept it near her desk and read from it each night. One line in particular she copied into her own notebook. He who tends the words of others must learn the language of stillness. She found in that sentence her own vocation. Over the years, she began to catalog the library anew. The old records were inconsistent, scattered between the abbey and the cathedral office. So she devised her own system, one that categorized not only by subject, but by sound. Books that rustled softly when opened she called whisperers. Those with brittle, noisy parchment she labeled speakers. The oldest volumes, whose pages barely moved at all, she named sleepers. It was not a practical system, and no one but Margery understood it, but to her it made sense. A library, she believed, was a conversation between silences, and she alone was fluent in that tongue. Her daily meals were simple: bread, cheese, watered wine. Her only luxury was beeswax for her candles, which she purchased herself when the cathedral's stores ran low. In winter, the cold crept into the library despite the stone walls, and her ink sometimes froze in the well. She learned to breathe warmth into her hands before writing. Once, when a young cleric mocked her for spending so much time among dust and decay, she replied softly, "The living forget faster than paper decays." He did not answer. Margery kept to her work. In her 4th decade as librarian, the town changed around her. The markets grew busier, trade routes opened, and rumors of new inventions, devices that could print words by the hundreds, reached even the cloisters, printing presses. They called them dot at first. She dismissed the idea. A machine making books seemed as absurd as a river weaving cloth. But the reports persisted. Soon, a printed Bible arrived in the city, rough, uneven, smelling of oil and iron rather than ink and parchment. The priests gathered around it, marveling at the speed with which it had been made. Margery stood quietly at the back, saying nothing. To her, the book felt strange and personal. Its letters to perfect, its pages to smooth dots. She returned to her manuscripts and her dusting. But a small unease took root within her. If books could now be made faster than one could read them, what would become of those written by hand? She tried not to think of it, but the thought returned each time she opened a centuries-old codex. Her hands trembled slightly when she touched the faded ink, as if feeling something precious slipping away. One evening, while cataloging a collection of forgotten sermons, she found a slip of parchment tucked between the pages. The writing was old, the ink faded nearly white. It read simply, "When the words multiply, the silence must deepen." She stared at it for a long time. Then she smiled. Perhaps the world could fill itself with words, endless and loud, but someone would always be needed to remember the quiet between them. So she continued her work, carefully, methodically. As the decades turned, the town outside grew noisier, but inside the library, all remained still. Only the faint scrape of parchment, the slow crackle of candle flame, and the gentle rhythm of Margery's breath filled the air. Every evening, before locking the door, she would pause at the threshold and listen. The silence seemed to hum faintly, as though the very air had grown aware of her attention. And in that quiet hum, she sometimes thought she heard the faintest whisper, not from any book, but from the space between them, a whisper that asked, softly, "Who will remember the ones who remember? Who will remember the ones who remember?" When Margery entered her 62nd year, the rhythm of her days had become so steady that even time seemed to slow to match her pace. The seasons turned like the pages of an enormous, invisible book, quietly, predictably, one after another. Winter was her favorite season. The cold preserved the parchment. It tightened the bindings, slowed decay. The mornings were her own, filled with the faint hiss of candle flame and the slow unfolding of manuscripts. She no longer counted her work in books, but in hours of silence. By her own record, a ledger she kept on the back of an old psalter. She had spent over 100,000 hours inside the library, each one she considered a small act of devotion. But the world beyond her stone walls did not sleep as she did. News of the printing presses spread faster than rumor could contain it. By the time Margery was an old woman, printers' shops had opened even in the smaller towns. Books that once took a year to copy now appeared by the dozen in market stalls. The cathedral library began receiving donations, printed psalms, sermons, and devotional tracts stacked carelessly beside her manuscripts. The abbot was delighted. "The word of God," he said proudly, "can now reach every home." Margery said nothing. She simply nodded, her eyes on the neat black type. The letters were flawless, identical, without the human tremor of a quill. They reminded her of soldiers standing in rows, disciplined, efficient, soulless. She knew the world would not stop to pity the old ways. Yet she could not help feeling that something sacred had been lost. Something in the weight of a hand-drawn letter, the pause between strokes, the quiet intention behind each curve of ink. At night, after her duties were done, she began copying one final catalog, not of books, but of moments. She wrote, "The day I first smelled the binding of a new volume. The afternoon the rain came through the roof and I dried each page by candlelight. The morning I heard the first printed book arrive, and the silence it brought with it." It became her private chronicle, not of history, but of quietness. One winter evening, the bishop sent a young apprentice named Thomas to assist her. He was perhaps 17, bright and eager, his clothes defined for the dust of her world. "I'm told you keep fine order here," he said on his first day, brushing snow from his boots. "I keep silence," Margery replied. He laughed, thinking it a joke. It was not. For weeks, Thomas helped her carry and sort the manuscripts. His hands were clumsy, his movements quick, and his patience thin. He asked questions constantly. Why are some pages darker than others? Why mend what can be copied cleanly? Why care for a book no one reads? Margery answered few of them. She had learned that true understanding cannot be given, only grown. Still, Thomas persisted. He was fascinated by her system of whisperers, speakers, and sleepers. One day, he said, smiling, "I'll make a catalog of talkers. The printed books. The loud ones. Perhaps you will," she murmured. "And when you do, I hope you'll remember the quiet ones who made space for them. Their companionship, though wordless, softened the long hours." Margery taught him how to repair bindings with glue made from fish skins, how to polish leather with wax and patience, how to recognize the scent of mildew before it showed on the page. But she noticed something in him, a restlessness she recognized from the younger world outside. One afternoon, she found him in the reading chamber, staring out at the town square where merchants called out prices, and children shouted over one another. "Do you ever wish," he asked, "that the world would speak more loudly?" Margery paused. "No," she said. "I only wish it would listen more carefully." He didn't answer, but his expression lingered in her thoughts long after he left for the evening. The years pressed on. One morning, Margery arrived to find the bishop himself in the library, flanked by two assistants. They were inspecting the shelves, making notes. We must make space, the bishop said curtly. The printed editions will replace many of these copies. They're clearer, cheaper, easier to read. Margery felt a coldness spread through her chest. Replace? She repeated. The bishop nodded. The old text will be sent to storage, some perhaps sold to scholars. We can't keep everything. Margery's hand tightened around the corner of her desk. For a moment she thought of speaking, of arguing for preservation, for reverence, for patience, but the words dissolved before she could form them. The bishop's men began stacking manuscripts into wooden crates. The whisperers, the sleepers, all lifted and carried away. She watched silently, her face expressionless, though her pulse beat wildly. When they reached her desk, one of the assistants picked up her favorite volume, the treatise on silence. This one, he said, looks worn. Perhaps it's of little use now. Margery reached out, took it from his hands, and pressed it gently to her chest. This one stays, she said. Her tone was soft but final. The men hesitated, then moved on. That night, when the library was empty again, she lit every candle she owned. The room glowed like a small golden sea. One by one, she walked along the shelves, touching each space where a book had been. The air still smelled faintly of parchment and beeswax. Then she sat at her desk and opened the treatise on silence. Inside the back cover, she found something she had never noticed before. Faint writing, nearly invisible under the candlelight. She leaned close. The ink had faded to brown, but she could just make out the words, when the noise of the world rises, build a house of quiet inside yourself. She traced the line with her fingertip, then closed the book. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to weep, not from anger or fear, but from a deep, exhausted love for the pages, the ink, the forgotten hands that had written what she now protected. When Thomas returned the next morning, he found her asleep at her desk, the candles long burned out, the book still open beside her. He covered her with a cloak and said nothing. In the days that followed, Margery's duties were quietly reassigned. The new librarians catalogued the printed volumes. The old manuscripts were sealed away in the cathedral cellar, their bindings wrapped in cloth. Margery moved to a small room near the bell tower. Her eyesight had begun to dim. Her hands trembled when she wrote, but she kept her notebook, her catalogue of moments, close. Thomas visited often. He brought her news from the library, sometimes reading aloud from the printed text. She would listen patiently, then ask him to describe the sound of the paper, the feel of the ink. He learned to do so with care. Before long, he began to understand what she had meant about silence. One night, as the bells tolled midnight, Margery rose from her bed and made her way slowly to the library. Her candlelight danced across the walls as she unlocked the old wooden door. The shelves stood bare in places, but the air was unchanged. It still carried that same soft stillness she had tended all her life. She walked the aisles one final time, her fingers trailing along the edges of the empty spaces. Then she placed the treatise on silence back in its original spot, whispering softly, "You belong to the quiet now." And with that, she left the library and did not return. Weeks later, when Thomas came searching for her, he found only her notebook, lying open on her desk. The final entry read, "When silence is kept long enough, it begins to speak. Long enough, it begins to speak." Years slipped by like dust through a beam of morning light. The world had changed noisily, irreversibly. The clatter of printing presses filled the towns. New books, fresh and cheap, stacked in every marketplace. Scholars debated in public squares. Pamphlets fluttered through the streets, and words, once sacred, once slow, became a constant murmur in every home. No one remembered the long stone library in the shadow of the cathedral. No one except Thomas. He had grown older, his hands roughened not by labor, but by turning pages. When he took over as caretaker of the collection, he cared what survived beneath the vaulted ceilings. The manuscripts Margery had once guarded were stored in the basement now, untouched for decades, their edges eaten by time. But every week, Thomas descended the narrow stairs to check on them. He would light a single candle, sit among the boxes, and open the treatise on silence. The first time he did, the scent of the parchment startled him. Faint wax, dust, and something sweeter, like the echo of old air. He understood, then, what Margery had meant when she said the books were alive. Not alive in the way people were, but in the way embers are, quiet, fading, waiting for someone to breathe them back to life. For years, Thomas tended the silence she left behind. He copied her notes carefully into new ledgers, catalogs of the forgotten, he called them. In the margins, he wrote his own reflections. Some silences are loud if you listen correctly. Each page holds the sound of its maker's breath. A library is not built of books, but of patience. The world above the cellar grew faster, brighter, louder. Travelers brought stories of cities where presses ran day and night, where libraries became marketplaces of thought rather than sanctuaries of quiet. But Thomas's library stayed still. He oiled the locks, repaired the hinges, and dusted the shelves, waiting for a day when someone might care again for stillness. Sometimes he imagined Margery's figure at her old desk, candle burning low, pen scratching across the parchment. He would catch himself listening for her faint footsteps, her deliberate breathing between words. He missed her presence, but more than that, he missed the order she brought, the sacred balance between noise and calm, between ink and silence. In the spring of his 50th year, a group of scholars visited the cathedral. They were historians of the new universities, looking for old manuscripts to study. Thomas led them down the stairs, heart pounding with a mix of pride and worry. The men coughed in the dust. Their robes brushed against the shelves. One of them, a young professor with ink-stained fingers, examined the bindings with wide eyes. "These are extraordinary," he said. "Unrecorded works from the 13th and 14th centuries. Do you realize how rare this is?" Thomas nodded quietly. "They've been waiting a long time to be read." The scholars spent hours sorting, listing, and marking the volumes for transport. They spoke of preservation and publication, of copying and cataloging, all in loud, hurried voices. Thomas stood aside, uneasy. At last, the youngest scholar noticed the small book resting on a pedestal, the treatise on silence. Its binding was cracked, its cover nearly worn through. He reached for it, but Thomas placed a hand over the volume. "Not this one," he said softly. The scholar frowned. "But surely, this one isn't for study," Thomas interrupted. "It's for listening." The young man looked puzzled, then shrugged and moved on. When they left, taking cartloads of manuscripts with them, Thomas felt both relief and loss. The library had given away much of itself. Yet, in that small hidden book, its spirit remained. That evening, he sat at the same desk Margery once used and opened the treatise on silence once more. Inside, he found a loose page he had never seen before. The ink was faint, the handwriting small and uneven, perhaps written late in Margery's life. It read, "If ever the quiet is lost, do not grieve, for silence is not absence, but waiting, and it will find those who remember to listen." Thomas closed his eyes. The candle flickered. The walls seemed to hum softly, not with sound, but with presence. He understood then that Margery's work had not been about preservation for its own sake. It was about attention, the slow, deliberate art of caring for things the world no longer noticed. Years later, when Thomas was an old man, a storm struck the town. Lightning cracked across the cathedral's spire, and rain poured through the roof. By dawn, the lower levels of the library were flooded. When the townsfolk came to help, they found Thomas knee-deep in water, carrying manuscripts to higher shelves. His movements were slow but steady, his face calm. Someone shouted for him to leave, but he only said, "These have waited centuries. They can wait a little longer." By the time the storm ended, he had saved what he could. The rest was gone, ink blurred, pages melted, bindings undone. Yet among the few remaining books was the treatise on silence, dry and intact, resting on the highest shelf. When they found him asleep beside it, his hands still resting on the cover, he looked at peace. After Thomas's passing, the library was restored, rebuilt, and renamed. The new scholars cataloged its remaining volumes digitally, every word, preserved in databases and copied across countries. But one section remained empty. It was the alcove where the treatise on silence had always sat. The book itself was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of preservation, misplaced or perhaps quietly taken. Still, visitors sometimes claimed that the air there was different, a faint scent of beeswax, a stillness in the dust, a warmth that made the candle flames bend toward that empty shelf. Generations later, long after the names of Margery and Thomas were forgotten, a line from one of their catalogs survived in a historian's notebook. It reads simply, "Silence has its own memory." And perhaps that is the truest history of all, not written in ink or stored on shelves, but carried quietly through time, like breath. When you walk into an old library, perhaps you feel it too, that faint hum between the shelves, that watchful quiet that seems alive. It is not the books themselves that whisper. It is the centuries of hands that once touched them. It is Margery. It is Thomas. It is the long patience of the human spirit, waiting, always waiting for someone to listen again.